Today on ENCORE, one of contemporary literature's most revered writers, Russell Banks. His work includes Affliction, made into a movie with Nick Nolte,
Affliction,
Continental Drift, Lost Memory of Skin, and Rule of the Bone. He's in France as his collection of short stories, A Permanent Member of the Family, has been translated into French.
Russell Banks, hello.
hello.
Thank you for speaking to me today. Now, you're on a book tour that's brought you to Paris at a very difficult time for the city. As an outsider, can you feel the difference in mood compared to the other times you've been here?
Oh, well, yes, of course, because I followed from when the attacks took place in the United States on live streaming on TV 24/7, and then arrived on Sunday, the day of the demonstration. And there is a sense here of shock and a need to express solidarity, I think, amongst all French people, and a need amongst all French people, and I mean all French people, to embrace those ancient and honorable values of free speech and tolerance, a great self-awareness of their importance here. In a funny way, you can kind of let those values lie for a while until somebody threatens to take them away or attacks them. And then suddenly you realize how much you need them and want them and treasure them.
And as someone like yourself who shares words and ideas, I mean, how did you personally live these attacks that many people say were an attack on freedom of expression?
Yeah, they are, of course, and the immediate response by artists, intellectuals, writers here and abroad seemed to me to be a perfectly appropriate one. I mean, I couldn't do my work, none of us could do our work, if it weren't for the constitutional in the United States and legal protection of those who aren't necessarily doing the kind of work that one might treasure or admire or need, you think you need. They have to be protected just as diligently as Voltaire and Rousseau or Banks or Rushdie. And so we know that. So it affects us all from top to bottom.
When you write, do you think about the possibility of offending people?
Actually, happily, not at all. You know? No, it does not. It does not come in. I mean, I think the only people I'm afraid of offending are people in my family and people in my close personal relations. I don't want to upset or offend them in any way by exposing them or their secrets to the public. But no, in the sense of political or social offense, I don't feel any restriction or inhibition. The great danger, of course, for a writer is self-censorship, the fear of saying something that will offend, that might offend, and so on. And that does go on. A recent poll taken by Penn American Center, the organization of writers based in the United States, of their membership, which includes thousands of writers, found that 65% of the membership felt that they had censored themselves on occasion.
But not you?
No, I have never, I didn't check that box when I took the poll. No, I haven't. And I don't think I will. But one has to be careful because it is sometimes unconscious. And you could see the American press in some ways censors itself. For instance, the New York Times refusal to print the cover of this Charlie Hebdo edition, or any edition for that matter, or any of the caricatures and cartoons. That refusal to print those is, to me, an act of cowardice and self-censorship, and utterly unnecessary. I think if every newspaper in America had published the cover of Charlie Hebdo, then it would have been a great blow for free expression. I was sorry to see the New York Times wouldn't do it.
Are you a political animal?
I'm a political animal.
As a writer, do you take political stands?
Well, as a citizen, I take political stands. As a citizen, I think of myself as an activist, and I do try to have some small impact on my government's and my society's political behavior, certainly. I mean, I think that's my responsibility as a citizen. As a writer, I don't take political stands. I have my sympathies and my affections and my interests, and they're almost always directed towards individual human beings, characters, not to classes or races or genders or political issues, but they inevitably arise in one's work. You can't avoid it. If you decide you're going to tell a story about a single human being, you're going to end up having to portray that human being's economic, racial, class context. That's the world. We all live in history. Every individual does, to a greater or lesser degree.
Back in the late 50s, though, you wanted to join Castro's revolution. What attracted you to that?
See, what gets on the internet never gets off, does it? Well, I was an 18-year-old boy, romantic, and I think a identification with the underdog led me to think it was actually political position rather than simply a romantic projection. And Fidel Castro and his revolutionary band of merry men were portrayed in the American press at that time as kind of like Robin Hood figures. You know, they were bearded, they looked like beatniks, and they were up in the hills of the Sierra Maestra, and they were trying to overthrow the hated dictator Batista. So I thought, well, they might use a little help, and so I hitchhiked down to Florida and trying to figure out how to get across to Cuba. In February of 1959, they marched into Havana and no longer needed me, and so there I was, stuck in Miami.
And at the time you were a painter.
That's right, that's right. I was an artist. I thought I was going to be an artist, and then I sort of fell in love with literature, and before I knew it, I was writing poems and writing Hemingway-esque short stories, and gradually I forgot about the painting and turned my life over to writing.
And you're here in Paris as your collection of 12 short stories, a permanent member of the family, have just been translated into French. Previously, your characters seemed to be looking back at their lives. In this book, in the stories, they seem to be looking towards the end of their own lives and looking forward.
Yes, I realize I don't think I could have written this book, these stories, when I was younger. They are the stories of an older man looking back over life, and very much with real awareness of mortality, of the end of life, and so the perspective is that of an older. They aren't narrated by older people, and they aren't all older people in the stories, but the perspective, I think, probably is that of a man in his 70s who's very much aware of the limits of life.
But themes that keep coming back, like alcoholism, divorce, is that a conscious choice of yours?
No, that just seems to me to be what surrounds us. Drug addiction, alcoholism, violence, divorce, loneliness, solitude, etc., and poverty, and financial and economic anxiety. These are the conditions that most people live with, and most, as it's been said, most human beings live lives of quiet desperation, and I think that's true. I'm sometimes accused of or maybe credited with writing about minorities or the invisible or the marginalized. But in fact, I think of myself as writing about the majority. Most people live lives that are very precarious, and if you upset one piece of it or take one part of it out, then the whole structure collapses. And most people know that, so they live with a certain degree of tension, anxiety, and dread.
Fathers and sons is another theme.
That's true.
That runs through your work. Again, in these short stories with Connie, for example, in former Marine, what was your relationship like with your father? My
father was not a model for me. He was, in fact, perhaps one of the reasons for my preoccupation with and recurring interest in themes of fathers and sons is that my father was an alcoholic, he was violent, he abandoned the family when I was 12, and I was the oldest child, so I was perhaps most affected in some ways by it, and so that early wound I think stays with you a long time, and it forces you to look at other people's lives perhaps somewhat differently than I might if I had been raised by the former Marine.
Did you manage to make peace with your father, or are you doing that through your writing now?
Oh, no, he died in 1979, but I did, answer to your question. He and I became rather close, actually, when, by the time I was in my 20s and 30s. And before he died, we had certainly resolved our particular disappointments and anger and resentment and so forth, so that I did not feel in any way a kind of loss, in the sense that I had lost an opportunity to resolve my anger and issues and conflicts with my father.
Russell, what's next for you now then?
That's hard to say, because I'm just in the early stages of a book, and that's the stage where you really feel like you're in a very darkened house and all you've got is a small flashlight, and you're just kind of poking your way through the darkness with a little bit of light. And I'm trying to write a book which may be a novel, it may not be a novel, it might be a nonfiction memoir, but it's much closer to my lived life, I should say, my autobiography, than anything else I've ever written.
Okay, Russell, wishing you lots of light. Thank you so much for talking to us. Thank you.